Dr. Mei Lin had always thought that time was something you could master, like a complex equation or a tricky experiment. In the world of temporal mechanics, where she was known as one of the brightest minds, time was both a fascination and a frustrating enigma. But as she stood on the edge of a tiny, bizarre island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, her belief in that old scientific certitude began to waver. She had come here for something simple, an environmental study, a little field trip to inspect rising sea levels and their impact on the surrounding ecology. Nothing too exciting, just another checkmark on the long list of things she'd promised to do that week. But as the propeller plane touched down on the small strip of land, Mei Lin felt a strange shiver of anticipation in her bones. It wasn't the kind of sensation you'd get from a mild chill or nerves. No, it was something deeper, as if the island itself had a secret to reveal, something that didn't belong in the natural world at all. "Welcome to your very own vacation from time," she muttered under her breath, adjusting the strap of her backpack. Her tone was dry, as always, but she couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled on her chest like a heavy stone. The plane had landed so smoothly, almost unnaturally so. There wasn't a single gust of wind to ruffle the trees, no flapping of birds' wings, no crests of waves rolling onto the shore. The island felt as though it were suspended, held in a momentary pause. Mei took her first step onto the beach, the grainy sand beneath her boots as motionless as the sea. "All right, let's get this over with," she muttered, taking out her tablet to record some preliminary data. But as she scrolled through her research notes, something caught her eye. Her watch, a sleek, silver piece she'd spent years designing, blinked erratically. It wasn't supposed to do that. The display flickered and skipped ahead, then back, before resetting itself completely. She glanced around. Everything, was perfectly still. Not a ripple in the ocean, not a single bird overhead. Mei could hear nothing except the rush of blood in her ears and the light rustle of her own breathing. "Okay, maybe I'm having a moment," she said, forcing herself to take a breath. "No big deal. Just a glitch. Or maybe I'm just jet-lagged." But as she walked further into the island, the eerie stillness remained. No animals stirred in the dense jungle behind her, no insects buzzed around her head. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath. After a few more minutes of uneasy investigation, Mei found something that shouldn't have been there, a perfectly still bird, mid-flight, hovering 5 feet off the ground. She froze. The bird's wings were locked in place, held in an impossible position. The creature's eyes were wide, the feathers stiff, and the faintest shimmer of what could only be described as frozen time pulsed in the air around it. "Okay, this is officially weird," Mei said aloud, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. She walked around the frozen bird, her curiosity piqued. The more she looked, the more anomalies she saw. A soccer ball, suspended in mid-air, it seemed stretched in a perfect, unchanging moment. A picnic scene, a family, smiling, hands half raised to hold sandwiches or drinks, frozen in mid-motion like a life-size photograph. It didn't make sense. How could this happen? Time wasn't just frozen here. It was paused. Trapped. Great. Just great, Mei muttered to herself. Maybe I'll just call this one in and let the experts figure it out. But deep down, she knew she wasn't going to do that. She had to understand what was going on here. Her scientific mind refused to let go of the puzzle. Mei walked further inland, leaving the surreal scene behind, searching for an explanation. The island seemed empty, as if it were frozen in time, and yet, there was an odd, almost oppressive feeling in the air, like it was just waiting for something to move, just waiting for something to break free. By the time she reached the jungle's edge, she had forgotten about the bird, the soccer ball, and even the frozen family. Instead, her focus turned to the faint humming noise that now seemed to vibrate in her ears. It wasn't natural. "Not good," she whispered. The humming grew louder as she walked, as if it were beckoning her forward. Mei followed the sound to a small clearing, where she found something unexpected, something that shouldn't have been there at all, a high-tech device, half buried in the dirt. She knelt down to inspect it, her heart suddenly racing. The device was covered in the same type of advanced materials she worked with, the same materials she had spent years studying for the temporal experiments she was involved with back in the lab. This wasn't just any gadget. This was a piece of technology that she recognized all too well. Her fingers brushed the smooth surface of the device. Her pulse quickened. May stood up abruptly. This shouldn't be here. The device, one she knew had been decommissioned, was clearly still operational. It was one of the experimental time control devices that her team had worked on years ago. An experimental machine designed to manipulate time by creating a pocket where time moved differently than in the outside world. It had been shut down after disastrous results during testing. But here it was, on this island. Sitting quietly. Waiting. And most terrifying of all, it seemed to be the source of the time anomaly surrounding her. Her mind raced, her breath quickened. If this device was still active, if it was still functional, then this island, the entire anomaly she was standing in, was the result of an experiment gone horribly wrong. The ground beneath her felt strangely unstable, and her head spun as if the world around her was warping into something unrecognizable. She stumbled backward, hands reaching for her equipment. The faintest whiff of déjà vu swept through her, and she had the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. Something had already happened. Something was waiting for her to find out. May's heart skipped a beat when she realized the obvious. She had to have been involved in this experiment. But how? She dug deeper into the device's control panel, her mind desperately grasping for any clue as to why the experiment had failed so catastrophically. The air around her buzzed again, as though the island itself was alive, watching her. But all she could hear were her own frantic thoughts. This was no ordinary time anomaly. There was a twist here, one that she wasn't prepared for. And that's when it happened. The air shimmered, and the device flashed, emitting a low, resonating hum. May jumped back. Before she could process it, a vision, no, a memory, flooded her mind. She saw herself, older, standing in front of a large team of scientists. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a memory she'd had before. She was seeing herself, her future self, giving orders. She was part of this experiment. She was the one who had made the decision to continue the trials, even after the warnings. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. This is my fault. She whispered, staring at the device. This is all because of me. But what had happened? What had gone so horribly wrong? And more importantly, what had she done to cause it? Mei Lin's pulse raced as the full weight of her realization crashed down on her. This was the result of her actions, or rather, the actions of her future self. She had read about the risks in the research notes, about the dangers of manipulating time. But to see it now, to feel the consequences wrapped around her like a suffocating fog, was another thing entirely. The humming from the device had stopped, but the sensation of being watched didn't fade. It lingered in the air like static, invisible yet inescapable. May's mind scrambled, trying to piece together what had happened, what had gone wrong. She reached for the tablet strapped to her arm, fingers trembling as she opened up her research logs from the past few days. The experimental data on temporal manipulation had been promising at first, but she'd seen the reports about the anomalies, the discrepancies, the warning signs that no one wanted to acknowledge. The whole thing had felt rushed, pushed by an urgency that May had tried to ignore but couldn't. There had been pressure, deadlines, a drive to break through the unknown, to change history, and to control time itself. Had they been too eager? Too confident? A crash of frustration rose in her chest. It wasn't just the failure of the experiment. It was that everything about this place, the silence, the stillness, felt wrong. Like the island was a mirror of her own doubts and guilt. She could almost hear her future self's voice echoing through the haze of her thoughts. The woman in the vision, her older, wearier self, had been in the same position once. They had both been consumed by the allure of controlling time. But it seemed they hadn't understood the cost. The device still sat there in the clearing, almost innocently. It looked like a piece of technology that could have been plucked from the future, sleek, silver, humming with quiet power. It was deceptively simple, as if someone had taken an idea too far, pushing it into a territory where things like time and space weren't supposed to go. May reached out again, this time more cautiously. Her fingers brushed over the controls, feeling a familiar warmth pulse through the device. The screens flickered to life. For a brief, unbidden moment, she was struck by the overwhelming urge to shut it down, to walk away, and pretend she had never found this place. But she knew it wasn't that simple. The very fact that she had discovered it meant it was part of her future, part of her destiny. She couldn't leave without facing it. Forcing herself to take a deep breath, May examined the interface, trying to make sense of the data streaming across the screens. The patterns were chaotic, incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't been part of the original research. But May had been. She knew what it was. Temporal destabilization. This island was the result of an experiment that had gone catastrophically wrong. The device was supposed to create a small, isolated bubble of time, an area where events could be accelerated, decelerated, or even frozen. But something had malfunctioned. Something had pushed the limits too far, and the temporal pocket had swallowed everything in its wake. The island, the trees, the people, everything was trapped in a moment that had never been meant to exist, the weight of it all pressed down on her chest. Her mind refused to accept the implications, but deep down, she knew the truth. The accident had been caused by her, or at least by the version of herself that had yet to make this discovery. The future May had sent this device back, somehow, either by accident or by design, to warn her, or to beg for help. The message from the future woman had been clear. Even if she didn't remember it, May could hear her own voice in her head, a bitter echo. "You won't remember me now, but you will blame me later." The words clung to her like a promise, like a knot she couldn't untie. She sat down, her back to the device, staring out at the stillness of the island. There had to be a way to fix it. There had to be something she could do to reverse the damage. Maybe if she could get the machine to reset, or reprogram it somehow, the time pocket could be collapsed. Maybe. A sudden noise behind her made her whip around, heart leaping into her throat. But there was nothing. No person, no animal, no disturbance at all. The island was as silent as before. Her thoughts spiraled, each new theory and hypothesis only digging her deeper into confusion. The last thing she needed right now was to start losing her mind. But something was pulling at her, something she couldn't ignore. The longer she stood there, the more she realized that the island itself wasn't just frozen, it was watching her. The oppressive feeling, the strange hum in the air, the way the landscape felt almost too perfectly still, it was as if the island itself was aware of her presence. "Come on, May," she muttered to herself, standing up. "Don't lose it now." With shaking hands, she reached for the device again, but this time she noticed something new, something she hadn't seen before. The screen flickered once more, but this time, the message was different. The characters weren't the usual symbols she was used to, not the complex time calculations she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, they were words. Words written in her handwriting. "You're too late." She stared at the screen, heart hammering in her chest. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her own. The message seemed to pulse with an urgency that made her stomach turn. She tried to touch the screen, but the moment her fingers made contact, the display changed again. This time, it wasn't words. It was a face that it was her face. The future May Lin was staring back at her from the screen. Older, more tired, but unmistakably her. And the expression on that face was something May would never forget. Desperation. Fear. And beneath it all, a deep, crushing sorrow. The image flickered for a moment, as if caught between two worlds, before the voice, her voice, broke through the silence. "I'm sorry," the future May whispered, her voice so faint that it seemed to come from all around her. "I never meant for any of this to happen. You have to stop it. You have to fix what we started." The device hummed again, the words of warning echoing in her mind. May felt her knees weaken. Her mind reeled from the realization that she was staring not at a machine, but at the consequences of her own mistakes. She was the cause. But the worst part, the part that cut deeper than any failure, was that she hadn't remembered this future. She hadn't remembered the woman who stood in front of her now, pleading for her help. The vision of future May flickered one last time, and in a final, desperate gasp, she said, don't let us, become this." Then, the screen went black, the silence in the air grew thicker, heavier. May stood frozen in place, staring at the empty screen, her hands trembling. It was clear now. The island was a manifestation of a mistake, a result of her own future actions. The woman who had warned her was herself, just an older version, scarred by the very decisions May had yet to make. But that meant one thing: if she didn't act now, she was doomed to make the same choices. She would become that version of herself, lost in guilt and regret. Her breath hitched as she turned back to the jungle, feeling the weight of time pressing against her. There was no more time to waste. She had to find a way to stop this. To fix it, but how? The thought of erasing everything, resetting the device, of risking the erasure of her own memories, of losing the knowledge she had of what had happened, gnawed at her. What if the experiment wasn't just an anomaly but a marker of her future, something that couldn't be avoided no matter how hard she tried? She swallowed hard and moved toward the device again, her fingers hovering over the buttons. The machine buzzed lightly, as though it knew what was coming, and that's when the answer struck her. The only way to stop it, the only way to reset the time pocket, was to destroy the device entirely. She had to sever the connection, break the loop, and in doing so, erase not just the island but everything that led her here. May stared down at the device, her hand shaking as she reached for the power switch. She hesitated. For a moment, it felt like she was on the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss that would swallow everything, but the future was already written in stone. She couldn't turn back. With a deep breath, May pressed the button. The world around her shuddered, and then, everything went dark. The silence was suffocating. It pressed in from all sides, a thick, heavy blanket that wrapped around her, suffocating the very air she breathed. May Lin had expected a jolt, a shock, perhaps a blinding flash of light. But there was nothing but the eerie, oppressive stillness of the island, hanging like a question she couldn't answer. Her fingers were still on the device, trembling slightly as they hovered over the now darkened screen. The familiar hum was gone. The island, the impossible stillness, it was all gone. In its place, an unsettling quiet, a peace that seemed to mock her. May took a slow, steadying breath. She forced herself to step back, her eyes flicking toward the jungle beyond the clearing. Was it over? Was it really over? The thought of the future, the woman she'd seen in the device, her future self, clung to her mind like a ghost. Had she really erased that version of herself, the one who had suffered, who had made the same mistakes? She didn't know. It felt too easy, too clean. The island was silent, frozen, and she didn't know whether that was a victory or a failure. She turned away from the device, stumbling slightly as her legs shook. The weight of what she had just done pressed on her chest. Had she truly fixed it, or had she just made things worse? Had she sealed her own fate? But the thought didn't have time to settle. Something changed in the air. A faint shift, a soft crackle, as if the world around her were waking up. She stopped, her heart skipping a beat. The trees, the leaves, everything began to move. Slowly, at first, like the first tentative steps of something long dormant. The air rippled with a low hum, not unlike the hum of the device, but this time, it felt different. It was a sound of life, a sound of time starting to flow again. A wave of motion ran through the island, and for the first time since she had arrived, May felt the pulse of life again. The soccer ball, still frozen in mid-air, dropped to the ground with a soft thud. The birds, their wings caught in frozen stasis for what felt like eternity, flapped their wings and took off in a sudden flurry. The picnic scene shifted as the people began to blink and move, looking around in confusion, unaware that they had just been frozen in time for what could have been centuries. May blinked, unsure whether she was seeing things clearly. The world was waking up, snapping back into place as if someone had simply pressed play on the pause button that had held it frozen. Her breath caught in her throat. Was this real? Had she done it? Was it really over? She stepped forward slowly, almost afraid to disturb the scene in front of her. Everything felt so unreal, like it was all happening in slow motion, as if the island itself was trying to adjust to the change she had made. She could feel the pulse of time returning, the flow of seconds, minutes, hours, all rushing back to their proper rhythm, sweeping through her like a tidal wave. But then, as she stepped closer to the frozen family, who had begun to move again, confused and disoriented, something caught her eye. A glimmer. A flash. It was her future self, the older May, the woman who had warned her, was standing at the edge of the clearing. She looked the same as she had in the device, though now she was solid, real. She was staring at May with an unreadable expression, her face hard, her eyes shadowed by years of exhaustion. But it wasn't just the future May standing there, it was the version of her who had lived through the disaster, who had witnessed it unfold and had been caught in the paradox of her own mistakes. May froze, unsure whether to approach. The other May, her older self, was motionless, locked in place as if caught in a moment that didn't belong. The silence between them was heavy, pregnant with unspoken words. May's heart raced as she stepped forward, cautious but compelled by a force she couldn't name. As she drew closer, the older May's lips parted. The woman spoke, her voice soft but firm, as though every word carried the weight of years of regret. "You shouldn't have done that," the future May said, her voice cracked with sorrow. "You don't understand what you've just done." May's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice sharp with confusion. "I stopped it. I stopped the experiment. I shut down the device." You've only delayed it," the older May interrupted, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You can't erase what's already been done. This island, it was never about time manipulation. It was about trying to control the future, trying to control fate. But you can't change that. You can't fix what's already been written." May shook her head, anger bubbling up in her chest. "No. I can fix it. I've already fixed it. This island is, don't you see?" The older May's eyes flashed, her hand coming up to gesture around them, at the waking world, at the people now slowly returning to life. "This place isn't just frozen time. It's a consequence. A consequence of the choices you made. Of the choices I made. The experiment didn't fail, it created something that can't be undone. We're trapped in this loop, May. All of us. The people here, the time we spent, the time you thought you could manipulate, it's all part of a cycle that can't be broken." "Cycle?" May said, her voice rising with panic. "What are you talking about?" "I destroyed the device. The time loop is over." The older May took a deep, ragged breath. "No, May. The loop doesn't exist in a single moment. It exists in the future, in the past, in every choice we make. You can't break it by destroying one device. Time isn't something you can control. It isn't a toy to be thrown around. You can try to erase the evidence, but the consequences will always follow." May stared at her, trying to make sense of the words, the weight of them sinking into her like a stone. Was this really the future that awaited her? Was this the life she was doomed to? Her future self seemed to read the question in her eyes. "This place," she said quietly, "is just a symptom. You haven't stopped anything. You've only postponed it. It will happen again. It always does. A silence hung between them, thick with unspoken truths. May could feel her chest tightening, the realization beginning to settle like a cold hand around her heart. No matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried to fix it, the cycle would continue. The experiment, the device, the island, it was all part of something larger than her, larger than time itself. She had been drawn into this web, and there was no escaping it. The older May's face softened, a faint glimmer of sympathy crossing her features. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "But there's nothing we can do." There never was. May's breath caught. The finality of the words hit her like a blow. The island, the people waking from their frozen sleep, the endless loop of time that seemed to stretch out before her, wasn't just a consequence of a failed experiment. It was a manifestation of fate itself. And she was its unwitting architect. Her knees went weak, and she stumbled backward, the ground beneath her feeling as though it were giving way. The air around her crackled again, a low hum vibrating through her bones. The island was alive again, but it wasn't free. It was still caught in the grip of time, still bound by the laws that May had tried so desperately to escape. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still again. The people, the trees, the birds, all frozen once more in that impossible, haunting quiet. Then, the hum came again, soft and insistent. May closed her eyes, and the world fell silent.